Could one dead pig start a war between two empires? In 1859, both sides were ready to fire. On a fog-covered island in the Pacific Northwest, American soldiers dug defensive trenches, while British warships anchored offshore with cannons aimed at land. No battle had begun yet, but that was mostly because no one had pulled the trigger. One nervous private, one misunderstood command, one flash in the wrong direction. That was the thin line separating a livestock dispute from an international war between the United States and Great Britain.
Over a pig. Seriously.
So how did the two most powerful nations on Earth end up measuring their artillery over a piece of pork? It all started with a spectacular failure of basic cartography and the 1846 Oregon Treaty. This incredibly vague piece of diplomatic paperwork was supposed to permanently settle the border between the U.S. and British North America. The treaty confidently declared that the boundary would run straight through the middle of the channel, separating Vancouver Island from the mainland. It sounded incredibly professional and utterly decisive, the kind of absolute certainty only rich guys in powdered wigs could conjure. The only problem? Mother Nature didn't read the treaty. There were two distinct waterways, the Haro Strait and the Rosario Strait, with a heavily forested rock named San Juan Island sitting right in the middle, practically begging to be violently colonized by arrogant bureaucrats.
Maps are hard, bro.
Naturally, instead of admitting they made a geographical oopsie, both empires looked at the map, squinted really hard, and decided that the treaty obviously favored their own rapacious territorial ambitions. If you drew the line through the Haro Strait, the island belonged to the United States, giving them a sweet strategic foothold. If you drew it through the Rosario Strait, the island was British soil, safely tucked under Queen Victoria's terrifying imperial skirts. Neither side possessed the humility to call for clarification, because in 19th century geopolitics, ambiguity wasn't a clerical error, it was a free pass to steal land. For over a decade, the island turned into a heavily armed homeowners association. American settlers pitched tents and started aggressively farming dirt, while the British-backed Hudson's Bay Company rolled in with sheep, pigs, and that legendary British condescension.
Just peak passive-aggressive neighbors.
This delightful Cold War of passive-aggressive livestock farming simmered until the fateful morning of June 15, 1859. Enter Lyman Cutler, a deeply irritable American prospector turned farmer who just wanted to grow some damn potatoes in peace. Unfortunately for Lyman, the Hudson's Bay Company had essentially turned the island into a free-range buffet for their animals. Specifically, one exceptionally gluttonous British black boar belonging to an Irishman named Charles Griffin, who managed the company's livestock. This pig was a repeat offender, a porcine menace that had repeatedly breached Cutler's pathetic fences to feast on his precious, painstakingly cultivated tubers. After weeks of finding half-chewed potatoes and hearing nothing but pompous British excuses from Griffin, Cutler's fragile pioneer psyche finally snapped under the immense weight of carbohydrate deprivation.
Dude snapped over carbs.
That fateful morning, Cutler walked out of his cabin, took one look at the British pig happily destroying his livelihood, and decided that diplomacy was a bankrupt concept. He didn't write a strongly worded letter to his congressman. He didn't try to shore up his wooden fence. He simply picked up his muzzle-loading rifle, took aim at the trespassing swine, and blew it to absolute kingdom come. The pig died instantly, achieving a level of historical martyrdom usually reserved for archdukes and kings. In that single, echoing gunshot, Cutler didn't just assassinate a farm animal, he inadvertently fired the opening salvo of what was very nearly World War I. He stared at the carcass, completely unaware that he had just handed two trigger-happy empires the perfect excuse to finally start butchering each other.
Rest in peace, Bacon.
Realizing he had just blasted corporate property to smithereens, Cutler tried to do the honorable thing and marched over to Griffin's place to pay for the dead porker. He offered a very reasonable $10, which in 1859 was a perfectly fine price for a dead pig. But Griffin, dripping with that unparalleled colonial arrogance, laughed in his face and demanded a staggering $100. To put that in perspective, that was like asking for a luxury car today because someone scratched your bicycle. The massive fine wasn't really about the pig's monetary value, it was a brazen power move. If Cutler paid the extortionate British rate, he was legally acknowledging that he was subject to British law, effectively admitting that San Juan Island belonged to the Crown. Cutler, possessing that famously stubborn American refusal to pay taxes or fines, told Griffin to kick rocks.
Inflation hit wild early.
When Cutler bluntly refused to empty his wallet for the Queen's royal swine, the British authorities threatened to drag him off the island and throw him in a damp Victoria prison. This threat hit the American settlers like a bucket of ice water. If the British could arrest an American on San Juan Island, then the island was British. Panic ensued. The Americans drafted a desperate, paranoid petition begging the U.S. military for immediate protection against the impending British tyranny. Enter Brigadier General William S. Harney, an anti-British hothead commanding the Department of Oregon. Harney didn't pause to consult Washington or consider the catastrophic global implications. He saw a chance to stick it to the British Empire and immediately ordered Captain George Pickett, yes, the very same guy from Gettysburg, to occupy the island with 66 heavily armed soldiers.
Sending the crazy guy.
Captain Pickett, a man who clearly believed there was no problem on Earth that couldn't be solved by dramatic posturing, landed on the island, planted the American flag, and issued a wildly provocative proclamation declaring the entire rock to be U.S. territory. He effectively dared the entire British Empire to come and try to take it from him. Naturally, the British Empire, which basically owned the planet's oceans at the time, did not take kindly to being bullied by a guy with a ridiculous mustache and 66 bored riflemen. Sir James Douglas, the fiercely protective governor of British Columbia, completely lost his mind. He immediately ordered the Royal Navy to mobilize, sending a massive, heavily armed warship to the island to show these upstart American potato farmers what real imperial firepower looked like.
Flexing on the haters.
What followed was a masterclass in military overcompensation. Within a few weeks, the British had parked 5 massive warships off the coast of San Juan Island, bristling with over 70 heavy cannons and carrying more than 2,000 highly trained, battle-ready troops. On the muddy shore, the American force had swelled to around 460 men, backed by 14 field cannons they had dragged through the dirt. For a solid month, the two forces just sat there, staring at each other through the dreary Pacific Northwest drizzle, completely paralyzed by the sheer stupidity of the situation. The British naval gunners literally had their fingers hovering over the lanyards, waiting for a single American to flinch, sneeze, or look at them funny. The atmosphere was so thick with tension you could cut it with a bayonet, all while the ghost of a pig watched from the great beyond.
Biggest overkill in history.
The absolute darkest part of this entire circus was that the broader political climate made a full-scale slaughter terrifyingly plausible. The United States was furiously tearing itself apart, hurtling headfirst toward a brutal civil war. And the last thing Washington needed was a two-front conflict involving the world's superpower. Meanwhile, Britain was dealing with its own imperial headaches and absolutely refused to look weak in front of its colonial subjects. The space for rational compromise had evaporated, replaced by the toxic, blinding venom of national pride. Soldiers on the ground were writing their final letters home, commanders were sweating through their uniforms, and everyone was secretly praying they wouldn't be the first casualty in a war that future historians would inevitably name after a farm animal. It was a spectacular display of testosterone-fueled diplomatic failure.
Egos ruin literally everything.
Just as the powder keg was about to explode, a sudden, shocking outbreak of common sense occurred, courtesy of British Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines. When he arrived on the scene, Governor Douglas practically ordered him to launch a full-scale amphibious assault and wipe the Americans off the map. Baines looked at the warships, looked at the mud-caked American trenches, and then flat-out refused the order. He famously declared that he would not involve two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. This singular moment of clarity effectively shattered the momentum of the crisis. Washington and London finally found out what their idiot commanders were doing on the ground and rushed to de-escalate. Both sides sheepishly agreed to stand down, leading to a bizarre joint military occupation where British and American troops camped on opposite ends of the island for the next 12 years, throwing dinner parties instead of hand grenades.
One guy used his brain.
For over a decade, this weird, heavily armed summer camp continued until the two nations finally decided to let Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany arbitrate the border dispute in 1871. The Kaiser's commission looked at the maps, laughed at the terrible 1846 treaty, and ruled in favor of the United States, officially drawing the boundary through the Haro Strait. In 1872, the British quietly packed up their royal sheep, hauled down their flags, and withdrew without a single shot being fired. Looking back, it is a brilliantly absurd reminder of how easily the world can stumble into the abyss of war simply because powerful men refuse to back down. The Pig War remains a masterclass in dark comedy, proving that the line between global catastrophe and a neighborhood dispute is terrifyingly thin. At the end of the day, no humans died, empires remained intact, and the only confirmed casualty was the guy who started it all.
Rest in peace to the real casualty.
If you enjoyed this absurd chapter of human history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the top left video to explore another unbelievable historical failure. We'll see you in the next disaster. Thanks for watching.